Okay, we are beginning to record. Hi, Steve.
Hi.
You do know that we start at 12:15?
Yes.
All right.
Late.
It is my great pleasure to introduce Dr. Scott Replogle, who's everything that's on the projector screen is being recorded. And so Scott is a regular attendee here. God bless him. He's a wonderful libertarian. He's got his authoritarianism, but he will not be talking about that today. Is that correct?
It's somewhat related, but not my topic, no.
Okay, not on point today. So with great respect for this man's intellect and his profession, I ask that we give him a round of applause and let him start.
Thank you. Are you okay on the mic?
Yes, we are okay on that.
Before I get started, I'm going to pass these around. This book I'm plugging basically because the second author is a good friend of mine from college days, and he gave me an advance copy. I did a review or edit for him and have reviewed it online, and I thought it was just superbly done about the latest in cell technology and without the hype, which is very important. So I'm going to pass that around just so you can see it. The other books are relatively recent.
Scott, could you hold it up to the camera and say
sure.
what the book is and who the author is?
You need to be recording it.
Oh, right. Hold on. Thank you. Hold it up.
Oh, yeah. Cells Are the New Cure by Robin L. Smith and Max Gomez. Max is my good buddy from college days. And the other books are relatively recent books relative to the subject of the day. The Truth about Medicare, Top 10 Myths of American Healthcare, and Medical Meltdown. Lee Heeb, who's I've met, she's a good MD. So I'll pass those around also, just so you can see it. But thank you very much for letting me speak today. This is one of my favorite topics, as you can imagine, because I have a personal stake or interest in it. And so I felt like the recent speakers who talked related to this subject weren't really getting at the fundamentals of the problem or the issue. And as you know from my previous talk and discussion, I'm really into the fundamentals. I'm not as interested in the specifics and the day-to-day arguments and so on. I really want to know what the issue, what the problems are, where does it come from, how did it get there, what can we actually do about it, rather than arguing the benefits of Obamacare or ending Obamacare or something like that. So let's go to the next slide. And you can jump in here, and at the end, if there's time, I've got a whole bunch of memes. I know some people are into memes and some aren't, but I've collected a bunch of them related to this subject, and if there's time and interest, we can do that at the end. But you can jump in and ask questions if you want. So last night I was trying to think about, the previous one. I was trying to think about really what I'm talking about, and the fundamentals are, or the fundamental problem is healthcare as a right granted or provided by government, healthcare as a system, fixing healthcare, and then distortions created by government and how we have tried to work around them. Basically what it comes down to, what I call the upshot, is we're doing as well as we are in healthcare in spite of government rather than because of it. So next slide. So a lot of you know this, but my background is that I'm a physician.
Oh, sorry. Sorry. All right, we'll get there.
Is that, I get the last, yeah, well, it's cutting off the last line there, but, so I'm a physician, but particularly my interest is in, as you know, in the history and philosophy of science, and medical science is part of that. And I have extensive experience with all levels of this issue, including academic, government, group practice, and solo practice. And I have also done solo practice as a black market of medical services where no third-party payers are allowed to have anything to say about it, which, as I've mentioned, I think before, is much easier to do for my specialty of plastic surgery than it is for other medical, other types of medical services. I also have experience with organized medicine. I was president of the Boulder County Medical Society just this last year for the second time. And I've been involved with some of my national organizations as well as Colorado Medical Society, the state society. And my attitude, as you know, is very anti-authoritarian. And I call myself a South Park Libertarian, and happy to go into that if it isn't clear where that comes from. But I've done extensive reading and understanding of the economics of this issue and why top-down centralized planning doesn't work for complex sectors of the economy, including medical services. Next. What are we talking about? The first thing is that medical services really are services that someone has to provide. There's some products involved, but for the most part, they're actually services, and it's not a unitary. It's not health care. It's specific medical services that apply or don't apply. And obviously, some of them are very important, even life or death, but they're still services that are provided by somebody to somebody else. So they are not fundamentally different than other services. And why would we think that the economics of providing a service would work differently for health services than they would for one somewhat different aspect is there is a need for what many would call a safety net, but even that, as we'll discuss, is better provided by voluntary or charity means, not by government force. And of course, we'll talk about the concept of health care as a right. Next. So this sums up what I was talking about. Healthcare is highly individualized and important services, and to a lesser extent products for healthcare needs and wants that are provided by someone else rather than the person directly. Next. So healthcare is not a thing. It's not something you have or you don't have. It can't be handled as if it were. And it's not insurance. I'll talk a little bit more about what healthcare insurance or insurance is and isn't. It's also not coverage. The concept of coverage doesn't really apply to services like this either, and is definitely not a right. A right is something that you already have, and it's the government's job to protect that right, not to grant it to you or give it to you or force somebody to give you because you supposedly have the right to it. Next. So that's why health care is not a right. It'd be like saying groceries are a right, or shelter, or any of a number of things that you don't have inherently, and you either have to obtain or have to be provided for you. It's not something that you have.
Right implies a duty.
No, I'm not sure about that. A right to me is something you already have. You don't get it from somebody. You have it inherently, like a right to life. If you're living, you have a right to life.
That implies a duty not to kill you.
Well, yes, that's the next step.
And right to health care implies a duty to enslave doctors to give you.
Right.
Or to enslave taxpayers.
Right.
Anyway.
Right. So I wanted to say something about insurance because the speaker 2 weeks ago, I think, really missed the boat on this one. This is a major problem in medical services. Insurance as a concept can work for products and services, but it only works to spread the risk of things that you don't want to happen, you don't expect to happen. But if they did happen, you couldn't pay for them right now. So you're basically spreading out the risk with someone who's making a profit of this. In other words, they're taking in more money than they're paying out to cover things like that you don't want to happen and couldn't afford to pay for right now if they did happen. That's very limited. It's usually called disaster insurance or emergency insurance in medical care. It is not whatever you want or think you need in terms of health care. The example that I always use is if you had insurance to cover your groceries, what do you think would happen to the cost of that and the control over what you want for your groceries? It would never work. Well, it doesn't work for healthcare services either, but that's what we keep calling medical coverage or healthcare coverage, as if it were insurance. The other is that it's a very important concept, and this is very libertarian. Individual choices and needs cannot be run by a system from the top down, central planning. They're inherently individualistic, and they cannot be decided by someone else. So what looks like a system, healthcare, or should be a collection of individual choices and how people interact with the people providing those services. Yeah.
It seems like you're confusing can't and should. Certainly there are places in the world where individual choices and needs are run from the top down.
Oh, yeah.
It's just that bad things happen when that happens.
Yes,
So
that's what I'm
the
saying.
word can't,
Okay.
to me, implies,
All right.
that there is no.
Okay, it can't be done well.
There's no evil empire that is forcing you, and there's certainly many examples.
Well, a large part of healthcare services in the United States now are run from the top down. And you're right, I shouldn't say can't, I should say can't be done well from the top down. So what happens to physicians and healthcare providers when government gets involved is similar to what happens in a monopoly, and I'll mention that again later. And the examples to consider are food, shelter, education, jobs. You can't have those decided from the top down. I'm sorry. You can't have them decided well from the top down. Okay, next. So this is a list of take-home points. And so I really want to emphasize these. This is sort of summarizes what I'm trying to get across. Healthcare is not a thing. Healthcare services are services. They're not, you don't have a right to them. Medical insurance is not coverage. All services in an economy work by free market exchange under stable rule of law, and they only look like a system because things like, the example I always use is evolution, looks like a system, but it's really just the collection of individual decision-making. So I'll have to change the word cannot here under complex, important, and highly individualistic services. Can't be run well from the top down. And safety net, as I mentioned before, safety net services, which I can expand on a bit, but they're better provided by voluntary means, as we were just discussing beforehand, than by some sort of government force. And single payer, Medicare for all, as you've heard about recently, there's no getting around it. These are government monopolies, and they act just like you'd think a monopoly would act. Even when you go back and look at something like Medicare, Medicare was basically a government monopoly on health care for seniors. And I even saw the era where they tried to prevent seniors under Medicare from getting any medical services from anybody else other than Medicare. And I've been doing like cosmetic procedures. You'd go to them and you'd say, well, you guys don't cover this anyway. Why can't this person come and have a cosmetic procedure? Oh, well, they're Medicare. They can't do that. That's what happens in a monopoly. Now, they lost that battle, and that isn't the case these days with Medicare, but that's exactly what you'd see with single payer or Medicare for all. Next. One of the things that's helpful when you look at this subject is to go back through history and see how the problems we have today developed over time.
What got cut off there? What did it say up top?
Problems of medical services in the U.S.
Now, I apologize, this is me not setting things up
The
properly.
bottom one is malpractice, litigation, costs, and effects. Basically, the problems in the United States got started during World War II as a response to wage price controls, which is typical. Wage price controls always cause distortion, market distortions, shortages, black markets. Well, what happened in World War II because of wage price controls was the use of employers providing medical care, medical insurance as a benefit to their employees. And this was the start of third-party payers. And although it shouldn't be illegal to do that, it shouldn't be a tax advantage. And it's a very poor way to get what you want or think you need by a third party paying for it, because eventually they're going to take over control of it. Another one was the use of insurance, as I mentioned, for coverage of medical services and needs. Medicare, of course, and Medicaid were the big ones in the mid-60s. These are basically welfare systems run and controlled by government, sort of the ultimate and third-party payers. And in the 70s, we had managed care, which was an attempt to run things from the top down. That largely failed and, for the most part, went away. Other big ones that we have still today are misunderstanding of costs. People somehow feel like if they have a right to it and they get it, it doesn't cost anything. And the way medical costs are figured in the United States is very poor and not comparable to other countries that are usually brought into the argument. The introduction of ideology in politics to individualized things like medical care, it just doesn't work. Somebody's idea of what you should do for your medical care is just not appropriate in a free society. You have to be deciding those things for yourself and your people that you voluntarily associate with. The other one I see is thinking of healthcare as a system, and we don't like Obamacare, so we're going to put our system in. Well, we'll see a meme about this, but that's no that's no solution. That's just substituting one government system for a different one. That's what is not appropriate for medical services. And of course, then there's the issue of malpractice litigation and costs and effects. You don't hear as much about it these days, and the main reason is that although insurance for malpractice insurance is still rather high and a significant cost to healthcare providers, most malpractice suits against physicians, if they go to court, the physician usually wins. And so malpractice attorneys, the strong arm and so on, are not as interested in malpractice cases these days because the malpractice insurers have learned to take it to trial, and they usually win. Next. So I mentioned this before. I think this is a very good analogy. If you're trying to figure out how this all works, imagine if your groceries were covered by insurance, supposedly, paid for by someone else. You can very quickly imagine what's going to happen to your needs and wants and what the cost would be if you look at the overall cost, what you're willing to pay for. The other one is that anybody who's going to pay for your needs or wants is going to control what things you can have and you can't have, or when you can have them. And from a physician's standpoint, they also control how much the physician's going to be reimbursed or paid to provide those services. They're right, they have to be provided. You have to provide that service. Okay, what are you going to pay me for that? Well, but they do get to decide how much you're reimbursed for your services. The other one was, imagine what you would do if you couldn't. Well, this is the way to think of this. Should probably put it in better terms. But if you're a physician group, or a hospital, and all your patients are Medicare, not Medicaid, Medicare, you can't survive financially. It's not possible. Now, what does that mean? Well, distortions are created because you have to make up for what you can't do for Medicare patients.
Cost shifting?
Well, that'd be one way to do it, but most physicians won't take like all Medicare or hospital because they can't survive financially, so they have to find someone who's paying more. Well, that distorts the cost of things, and that's why insurance and all kinds of other things are the way they are. Now, Medicaid is worse than Medicare in terms of reimbursement and inability to be financially viable. And Obamacare is an extension of Medicaid. So that's how to think from a physician's standpoint about how do we deal with these government plans and controls. Next. So I thought I'd say a few things about solutions. Obviously, the real solution is to get the government out of healthcare services entirely, but that's just not going to happen. And that's why government continues to grow and never seems to get cut back. But that's actually the answer. We could figure out how to deal with all aspects of medical services, including those who can't afford them, if the government weren't trying to control it. When you look at education services, I always mention this, that it's a little bit like public education or government schools and private education. If you can afford it and you don't like the care that's provided by the government or the education, well, you can go to private schools, but then you have to pay for it. So one solution has been vouchers, where you pay taxes, the government takes and wastes and is corrupt and uses all this, and then gives a certain amount of it back to you for you to then go purchase the education that you want. Well, obviously not a very good solution, but it's been one way to get around government control of schools. And the same thing will be happening in medical services. Another way to think of it is that if government it's a right and government can provide this, well, gee, we should have VA medicine for everybody. You know, just everybody can go to the VA for their medical care and needs. Well, how well do you think that would work? I saw patients back in the late 70s and early 80s at the VA hospital, both here and at San Francisco, that were eligible for VA care, but didn't like the care they were getting and found other ways to get their medical services instead of using the VA. That was 30, 40 years ago. It's even worse now. If the government provided the safety net of VA care, most people, at least if they could possibly afford it, would not want to utilize it. So government medicine is not the answer to the problem. Next. I collected, when I was doing this, I collected, I hope you can read that. This is a collection of aphorisms, maybe I can pass this around, that I find very useful to explain my position, to get other people to understand what we're talking about. For example, I use the term Santa Claus economics to describe socialist or progressive. You can have whatever you want or you think you need. Government will provide it. It's free. Well, that's like going to Santa Claus and saying, I want a bicycle. It doesn't work economically. But there's some other things that I feel are important, and I collected here, and you can ask me questions about that. Next. Here, I'm gonna.
Did we have time to read those aphorisms?
Wait, next.
Do you want me to go after this?
No, before.
You mean previous?
That was it, okay. Did we? Yes, we got these, okay. All right, so that's the main things that I wanted to talk about. How's our time?
We're at 1 o'clock. I want to take 2 minutes to ask for your indulgence to give us 2 minutes.
Yes.
And Peggy, if you want, and with Scott's permission, I can send you the PDF by email.
That would be great.
Could you send me an email and request it, and I'll send it on to you?
Okay.
And that, of course, goes to everybody. You're on.
Okay. So that was the summary of my position on this subject. And again, it's very general. It's very what I call fundamental, rather than specific problems of this area or that area or this state or that state, or the Democrats' plan versus the Republicans' plan or something like that. And I try to make it somewhat personal in terms of how physicians view it. I think most physicians feel that they have to find some way to work around the system so they can be successful, rather than trying to get the government out of it completely. But there will be more and more physicians who will be trying to provide services completely outside of government and insurance controlled systems. Insurers basically, like other big businesses, try to use politics to their advantage to try to get as much as they can out of the government systems, and they're not the government, but they're still somebody deciding things for you in terms of what you can have and who you can see and all those sorts of things. So before we get to any aphorisms or any memes, what questions?
Well, in terms of government involvement in healthcare, I've heard often that it's sort of the New York taxi cab problem, that the reason that physicians are paid so much and there's so few of them is that the AMA as a union has significantly limited the number of people, the number of medical schools in the country, so that by doing a medallion kind of thing, and each state does it too, that we actually have a lower physicians per capita than many other places in the world. Am I full of it, or is there actually a limitation on the number of graduating medical students here?
No, I don't think there's a specific number. The AMA used to be relatively powerful and did get involved in things like credentialing and you know, who can do this, do that. They have, these days they have relatively little power or influence because the government has, and the insurance companies have taken over most of it. But there is an issue, and it's a real one, of credentialing, of who can be a physician. Now, what you'll see with government care, government provided care, you will have more and more non-physicians providing the care that used to be provided by physicians, because they don't have to pay them as much. When you look at that from a personal perspective, I went through 4 years of medical school and 7 years of residency training before I could be a physician, or at least a plastic surgeon. I ended up cutting out a year along the way, but many surgical specialties are 4 years of medical school after college, and then 7 years of surgery training. The easiest, or the least, is 3 years of residency after medical school. Family practice, some of the basic medical care will do residency in 3 years. But you can imagine the time and the cost that's involved with that, and then getting into practice and being told what you can do, what you can't do, how much you're going to be reimbursed, and you can't make it financially if you just...
So who makes those rules?
Government.
So the 7-year rule and those sorts of rules are government rules?
Oh, no, I'm sorry, I misunderstood. Those are largely tradition, and it's national well, there are national organizations, for example, board certification in, say, general surgery.
So we could consider the board the union, because they're the ones making the rules saying you have to have a 7-year apprenticeship.
But who can say who can do what at the service level is often decided by the state or whoever is paying for the services. So in other words, it's one thing to say, oh, well, I'm a board certified general surgeon or plastic surgeon or whatever, but someone else can do the same things that you can do, and that's fine if somebody wants to go to somebody who's not a board certified plastic surgeon.
Well, I want to go to a veterinarian for my medical care, and you know, why can't I do that?
Well, you can, you should be able to, but if insurance is paying for it, they get to decide who you can go to or who they will pay for that service.
Scott, we have the gentleman behind you who wishes to make a comment or a question.
Okay.
70 cents out of every healthcare dollars goes to treat chronic illnesses. And it seems to me there's insufficient incentive to forego all of that revenue and cure things or teach prevention. Any thoughts on how we can correct our errors, biasing things toward paying and paying and paying and paying?
Well, that's a complicated and important issue, and I didn't really get to that. But the sort of attitude of some is that doctors want to make a lot of money, so they like to treat chronic illnesses rather than cure things or prevent things. And I don't really see that coming along. As a surgeon, I'm more interested in, what can I do and do it and get out rather than managing illnesses or curing illnesses or things like that. But I didn't see that. Doctors usually go into medicine not to make a lot of money or to, take advantage of people's illnesses and things. So I don't think there's really a simple answer to the problem or the question of chronic care versus curative care. I think most doctors really, if a cure comes along, they're not going to say, oh, well, you can't do that, or I'm not going to have that, or whatever, because I want to keep treating your diabetes or whatever it is. I guess that I see that problem as taking care of itself if people could really make up their own mind about what they wanted or thought they needed in terms of healthcare services. I mean, there are people who go to acupuncture and all these things that are based on placebo effect, and fine, go ahead. But should insurance, medical insurance, cover acupuncture or homeopathy or something like that? I mean, it really should be up to the patient whether they want to go to somebody for treatment like that doesn't cure, but chronically supposedly treats it.
Well, let me follow up on what the gentleman in the corner. Perhaps physicians are, by their nature, altruistic, but perhaps the drug companies are not, because they are spending vast amounts of money through a regulatory system that says we've got to recoup our investment. So if I have a cure for ingrown toenail, or whatever, do I promote that cure after having spent $500 million having a palliative for ingrown toenail? So I asked that question to you.
Well, that's another complicated, multi-level, multi-answer situation. But basically, in products, whether they're health products or everything, there's always a profit incentive in the market. And part of the reason that the cost of developing it, patenting it, and so on is so high is, of course, government regulations. But free markets can sort that sort of thing out pretty well if patients look at the value of the product for themselves and what they're willing to pay for it, rather than thinking someone else, an insurance company or the government, is going to pay for my whatever it is that I want or think I need. There is no perfect solution or answer to that question. And yes, products are a little more profit-driven than medical services by physicians are, I think.
I'm sorry,
No,
Peggy, go ahead.
Well, I always think of like LASIK surgery.
Right.
Insurance has never paid for that,
Right.
and it's done nothing but go down in cost.
Right.
And probably up in quality.
And up in quality, exactly.
Plastic surgery
Is probably-
cosmetic plastic surgery is the same.
Same.
What's basic surgery?
One of
LASIK.
my,
Oh, LASIK, I'm
Yeah,
sorry.
sorry, no. But, I mean, to me, that,
right, it's because LASIK was never involved with insurance.
right,
So that's the major government regulations and insurance and who pays for it are the major.
Well, and I can
distorting
even,
factors.
like, remember when I was younger, like, dentists, I don't know if they even took insurance, and dental care was not as expensive, you know, compared to take-home pay versus, or, you know.
Right. Well, that, actually, dental care is a good example. Dentists who have gone with insurance or other things hate it and done poorly with it.
Right.
And the cost in terms of dental care where the patient decides who they want to see and what they're willing to pay for, or even on down. So, again, it's the distortions created by regulations, by control, paying for it, all those sorts of things. One of the aphorisms that I mentioned is there's only two things that actually reduce costs or prices. One is activity, which means I can do it more efficiently, so the cost can come down. And the other is competition. And the government lacks both of those. So you're just not going to see prices or costs coming down if government or third parties are involved with it. And a lot of these insurance companies are working to try to prevent competition. It's like, we're going to survive and the government's going to help us keep everybody else out. Yeah.
Do you think there's really any chance that we could avoid total government takeover?
Well, I see it again as kind of like education. I think there's going to be strong, what you could call a black market or a move towards getting your medical care outside the control system. And the government will try to prevent it and so on, but people will find a way to do that. Now, that's not a great solution, just like it isn't in education, but that's what I see as happening. I don't see how we're going to get government out of healthcare services completely, at least in this country.
Well, I have a question. When you talked about, you know, doctors or, you know, say, okay, we pay $50 a month and we go to our doctor and stuff. Because, like, my insurance is so high now, $1,000 a month, $13,000 deductible,
Right.
and I'm healthy. So, I mean, I maybe have $100 a month or a year that I pay to a doctor for a sinus infection or whatever.
Right.
So I'm paying all of this money, which I would much prefer paying the $50 to a doctor or whatever. But
Right.
then, you know, you have a heart attack or you
Right.
need something. I mean, how does that happen?
Well,
Or how
first of
could
all,
that
you're
work?
seeing the distortions created by use of insurance for basic medical needs and wants.
Right.
That's because insurance isn't meant for handling that sort of thing.
Right.
Again, if your groceries were covered by insurance, that's exactly the type of thing you'd see. So the best answer, you mentioned the $50. They're what usually called concierge service, where you pay for basic care from, say, a primary care or an internal medicine physician, and you pay whatever known amount, and they spell out what all that covers and how many office visits or whatever. And those sorts of things are kind of what I'm describing in terms of voluntary systems that can work. Now, in terms of true emergencies, that's where insurance comes in. You want disaster insurance to cover things you don't expect to happen, don't want to happen, and couldn't pay for if they did.
Well, yeah, and that's kind of like my policy now, but I mean, it's $1,000.
No, your policy now is coverage.
Right.
It's trying to provide all kinds of
Right.
things, medicines or whatever. And then as they find they can't really do that, then you start paying co-pays and
Right.
and deductibles and all that kind of stuff, which again is what you see if you were insurance covering your groceries. So it's a doomed system. That's the way out of it. I see is people will increasingly go to who they want and pay something like a concierge or per visit like they do with dental care. And then hopefully there will be insurance companies or carriers who will provide true disaster insurance for the things you don't expect or don't want to have.
We have Steve and Mike, did you have your hand up?
Jerry?
Oh, okay, Steve and Heidi. And then,
Insurance thing sounds great, sounds like common sense, but does it exist at all right now?
Well,
Or has it been totally,
yeah, it's been so distorted as insurance carriers are taken over, that I don't know that, I don't know personally actually that exists, but that's basically what you need. If you're gonna try to provide for your needs while you're healthy, or your wants while you're healthy on a per visit or concierge type thing, then you still want disaster coverage, emergency.
let me jump in and, before Heidi and Larry. Years ago, I was lucky enough to get from my insurer, AXA Equitable, disaster insurance. I have a $10,000 deductible, actually $12,500 deductible, and I have to pay up to $12,500, and then they kick in at 100%, okay? For whatever reason, that coverage went away, but they grandfathered it in, and I was extremely lucky. We had, over the last 20, 25 years, only 2 or 3 years where we went over our deductible, and we pay about $4,000 a year for a family of 2. Actually, a family of 3, but let's not get into that. So it existed, and then something happened, and I don't know what it was, that the market just disappeared. But they allowed people who had that coverage to remain. I still have that coverage. I take that back. My wife has that coverage. I have Medicare, which provides actually better coverage at roughly the same price that my wife, her coverage with a $12,500 deductible. I just bring this up as historical. I wish it existed. I have been unable to find it for any of my friends.
Again, you're confusing coverage with insurance.
right?
Insurance is like homeowners insurance. You don't, and disability insurance is another example. It doesn't cover basic anything, and you don't want it to. I've never used my homeowners insurance or my disability insurance, because fortunately nothing happened that I couldn't pay for, or, well, medical should be in the same category, and I don't know, it's just not, I'm hoping that will come along. I'm seeing a lot of movement towards the concierge and providing services outside surgical procedures like I did, and things outside the system.
Did you think there would have to be both? Like, if you were going to get concierge, like a plan with a direct
Right.
doctor, then you would also need this,
Yes.
and it doesn't exist. This is like where I'm.
I don't know for sure that it doesn't exist, but I don't have personal
Yeah,
experience with that.
If you're-
They should, the concierge people should be telling you that.
Right.
Okay, here's what we cover for your basic limited amount. This, that, or the other will need some sort of, yeah.
If you're not near a microphone, please speak up or get the microphone near you.
Okay, who has-
And Heidi is next.
Heidi.
Here are a few little questions. You can answer whichever one you want. How do you feel about this, like, monopoly on ambulance services? Our county, like, gives one exclusive contract to one company, and they charge like $1,200 or $1,500
Yeah.
for a ride to the hospital. That's pretty outrageous.
That's what
I mean,
happens. That's what happens.
even if
with
it's not a blood
monopolies.
and guts emergency, and
Right. Well, now, I can give you another example. They have a deal with hospitals that, and I did this at an emergency room visit, turned out I passed a kidney stone, and I was okay. But the charges were pretty substantial for the hospital and the physicians, but insurance paid for it. charge me on top of that. And I'm, kind of know how the system works, and I said, look, the bill that I got was paid by insurance, it was perfectly reasonable. It's only because the government allows them to overbill me on the hope that they can take some more money in off somebody paying it. When I confronted the physicians group for the emergency room, they said, oh, don't worry, forget it, drop it. But the hospital sent me to collection.
Well, if any of us have that kind of a problem, you're a voter, who should we contact? Like, is there a patient advocate or something?
That's a good question. That's a very good
I
question.
mean, you're an insider, but what about the
if
rest
you,
of us?
If you needed an ambulance, that's something that insurance might cover, and they may actually cover it at a reasonable amount. But if the monopoly, an ambulance company, gets to charge you whatever on top of that, they're going to try to force you to pay that. And
Yeah, but it's the poor uninsured guy who needs help more than anybody,
Yeah.
and he's the one getting utterly
Yeah.
screwed by the
Well, and
caution.
I'm fortunate also, I didn't care that my credit rating or, whatever would go down, because they sent me to collections, and I said, I'm not paying it.
You
But
know,
a lot of people do.
I was gonna say about that, I lived in Breckenridge for years, and once all of this came in, if you were skiing and you broke your leg, your insurance will only cover a certain ambulance that will have to take you
Right.
down the hill, not to Frisco,
Right.
to the hospital. So it's
Right.
almost to a point before you do anything like skiing or whatever, you better really know your insurance company
Yeah.
and
That-
what they're gonna
that's
pay
like
and
insurance.
the ambulance.
Yeah.
That's like insurance, for, you can only go to see so-and-so. You can't, if you wanna go to this doctor or whatever, oh no, you can't do that, they're not
Yeah.
covered.
Boy, when I lived and worked in Vail, I didn't ski because I was uninsured. It's almost like I didn't dare to ski.
Yeah.
Anyway, one more question.
Yeah.
Dispatch Health, is that an app? It's kind of like the Uber of the business where a physician comes to your house. Do you know about that?
Oh, that's one, I've heard about that, but I don't know the specifics, but that's one of the, to provide, telemedicine is another one. There are some things that can be handled that way.
Oh, yeah. Just
Yeah.
take a picture of your rash and send
Yeah.
it to somebody, physician in
Yeah.
India or somewhere.
That's not as simple as it might sound. Because I run into that, and there are some things where you really do need to see the patient directly and talk to them, not just telemedicine it. But those are attempts to try to work around the system. Yeah.
Okay, we have Larry and Heidi. Have your questions been answered?
Yeah.
Our next person is Larry, and then Ralph.
Last March, I was tripped and fell backwards and smacked my arm into the floor or the back wall, one of them extremely hard. And I was black and blue and pink and purple and green from my fingers up to my shoulder. And I had an MRI done on it. My doctor said I needed surgery because I had a ruptured tricep tendon back here. And I called a friend of mine that lives down in Rio Grande County, San Luis Valley area. There is a, what would you call it, homeopathic healer down there who I took her advice rather than the surgery, and my arm is fine. And she claims to have cured people that have needed hip replacements and knee replacements and all sorts of things.
Yeah.
For,
Well, in general, I feel you should be able to choose that approach, and because that's what you think is best for you. I can tell you that there's a lot of placebo effect, and there's a lot of people who think cause and effect, the treatment that you got substituted for the surgery. But it turns out a lot of things get better on their own, regardless of what you do. And my guess is that the diagnosis wasn't correct in terms of needing a surgical repair of that. Unfortunately, you did fine with the non-surgical treatment of it. But bottom line is, individuals should decide for themselves how they want to go with that. You could have also, when it's not a true emergency like you got to operate right now, you could have gone to different specialists and said, okay, what operation do you have for this? How much is that going to cost? Do I feel comfortable with you, and so on? And then decided who you wanted to see. But you can't have a system that covers whoever you want to go to and whatever they want to charge. So you ultimately should be in control of that. You could have had a poor outcome from that decision. Fortunately, you didn't. But my point is, you should be able to decide that.
Right. My point was that she's claiming 80% of some of these surgeries, like hip replacements, and knee replacements, they're getting out of hand, and
Yeah. Well, there are some ones like back spinal surgery where the problem is we really don't have a good way to know exactly what the problem is and what's going to fix it. And so the surgeon makes their best guess and does something, and sometimes they even make it worse rather than fixing it.
yeah.
And since most things get better on their own, you can make it look like your homeopathic treatment or whatever made it better. So it's a complex area, and really, again, I don't believe this woman that you're describing. I don't think that's legitimate, but you should be able to decide that for yourself. But then you should be the one that has to pay for it somehow.
Right. That San Luis Valley is a poor area, and a lot of people
Yeah.
around there go to her. And
I mentioned safety net. Let's say you truly couldn't afford to pay it. Well, there should be some form of safety net available to do that. Now, let's say you went to the VA for it, and they said, well, we don't cover, we don't do homeopathic treatments. We're gonna do this, and you can take it or leave it. And you say, well, gee, I don't really, I don't like the care I'm seeing or I'm getting at the VA. Well, again, then you're gonna have to go to find somebody else to do the service that you feel you want or need. And that's what I saw way back when, is that people were eligible for VA care but didn't want government medicine. And it's only gotten worse. But that's one form of safety net that I think is sort of likely to occur.
Okay, so it's Ralph and Jerry. I'm going to amplify what Scott said. The number I have heard, and it could be apocryphal, is that 98% of the things that people go to see doctors for will cure themselves. That other 2%, that's a real problem. And as lay people, we don't know which is which. But I guess if you got
Sometimes the doctor doesn't either.
that may be true as well, Scott. My question to you, would you be comfortable in a world without the FDA?
Yes.
Okay.
What about without government licensing of doctors?
Yes, but you can do licensing and FDA type things voluntarily.
Sure.
They don't have to be government
Sure.
controlled. For example, you could get a license from so-and-so non-governmental agency, and you think, well, that's fine, that's great. Or you think, oh, that license from them?
Yeah, yeah.
I'm not going to that
You have to
person.
good housekeeping seal of approval or underwriter's laboratory seal of approval.
We see this all the time in terms of people doing what are cosmetic procedures or whatever that are normally plastic surgery, but they're not plastic surgeons. Well, my feeling is, go ahead. If you know that person is not a plastic surgeon, you want them to do that procedure, go ahead. What I object to is that person claiming or misrepresenting themselves
Sure.
that they're a plastic surgeon.
That's fraud.
Which we see, unfortunately, too much.
Or a board certified plastic. They can call themselves whatever they want to,
Right.
but to say I have membership as a
Right.
board certified plastic surgeon, now that's an interesting. When somebody says I'm a plastic surgeon in your world,
Mhm.
okay, and they're not board certified, is that legal or illegal? Are there any state or federal laws involved?
I don't think so. I mean, that's what we get into battles all the time, is doctors who misrepresent their credentials or their specialties and try to pass themselves off as a plastic surgeon, I'm a facial plastic surgeon. Somehow they get the term plastic in there. And that, to me, is the problem. That's fraud, in effect. Whether you can do anything about it or not is another question. But yes, I think people should be able to decide for themselves whether they think that license is valid or that drug has been proven to be safe
Yeah.
without the FDA. I mean, the FDA now has approved a drug to use for fibromyalgia, which isn't a legitimate disease. It doesn't have a legitimate diagnosis or physiology or anything. But somehow it got FDA approved. So obviously government regulation and things like the FDA aren't the answer to everything. And yes, I do think we could survive and do well without it.
Jerry, please pull the microphone towards you because our listeners will not. Mike, you hand the microphone to Jerry. Before you go on to Jerry, Scott, fibromyalgia doesn't exist? Is that
Well,
what you're saying?
It doesn't exist as a objective diagnosable disease. It exists in terms of people call it that. They think they know what they're talking about, but it's not. I mean, there's other examples like chronic Lyme disease is another current one. They don't have a legitimate method of diagnosis, and there's no way to say you have it and you don't have it, or I give you this drug and you get this response. It's all subjective. It's all claim. Mental health diseases are very.
I was
very
thinking with
much in the same
Alzheimer's.
thing.
You don't know until you're dead.
Depression?
Alzheimer's is
You can-
has real pathology. It's not
Understood, but you don't know that pathology until the patient.
sure, but they're getting ways to see it, to diagnose it. And that's in a legitimate disease. That's what you'd expect. As we get better at figuring out that you have it and it's this, and we'll respond to that. But that's a good example of people who are convinced they have fibromyalgia and doctors that will give them that diagnosis. And now there's an FDA-approved drug for it. It's astounding, but that's the way it is. Jerry, go ahead.
Your last subject raises a second question I'll ask first.
Yeah.
What about rating services? Not just
Sorry?
licensing services, but
Yeah.
what's your opinion on the quality of doctors?
That's a tough one. Obviously, I wouldn't say it should be prohibited, but it's difficult to establish the criteria that you're using for the rating. And I would not be too inclined to accept a rating on some of the ones that we're seeing unless I really knew what was behind it.
And it's difficult to keep people from stuffing the ballot box.
Yeah.
That's right.
Yeah. No, something to consider. If you were looking.
Are there such services?
Yeah, I think there's a lot. Well, I see a lot of online ratings and
Yeah.
testimonials and comments and so on. I mentioned even writing a review for my friend's book. Take it for
Yeah, okay.
what it is.
My other question.
I even admitted that I was you know, I knew him from college. So I'm biased.
My other question is, what happened back at the beginning of Medicare and Medicaid when some of us were self-insured and others were not?
For medical care for everybody over 65. Medicaid was aimed at people who supposedly couldn't afford it. But Medicare really tried to take over the medical care and services for those 65 and over. And as I said, they originally started out trying to prevent those people from going to anybody else for care or services, even for things that Medicare didn't cover. But they lost that battle. Medicare people can go to somebody else for services and pay for it themselves.
But what happened between the two groups? Some that had been paying for insurance, and those that...
I don't know. What I saw, and I was in medical school from 73 to 77, so I didn't really see Medicare when it got started in the mid-60s, but there were a lot of, I'm going to say a lot, there were definitely doctors who took advantage of the Medicare welfare system. The ones I saw the most were kidney doctors, kidney specialists, and the type of service that you need to maintain things when your kidneys are failing. They made out like bandits for Medicare. And eventually, Medicare got to the point where they said, well, we don't care what you say your bill, your cost of your service is, we're only going to pay you this amount. And so people some try to figure various ways to manipulate the codes and paid more.
Scott,
Yeah.
can I ask you to move your microphone closer to your mouth?
Oh,
or-
sorry. I'm one. So I'm not sure what actually happened to those who had their own insurance when Medicare came in, but I think it was forcibly displaced because Medicare acted like a monopoly.
And did those who had paid for insurance treated any differently from those who hadn't?
Well, again, if you're paying for your insurance, you at least have better control over it than if somebody else is paying for it. So we've seen, as I said, people doing as well as they are in spite of the system or working around it rather than good things happening because of Medicare, Medicaid, or Obamacare, or whatever it is. And we're pretty smart. People find ways to work around government regulations. I think that's what black markets are. And that's okay for some people, but it doesn't really help at a society level.
We have the gentleman behind you who wishes to make a comment or ask a question.
Okay.
And then we have a whole bunch of slides we haven't gotten to yet.
If we have time, yeah, I'd like to run through them just for your entertainment, if nothing else. They're memes. So
Lyme, Connecticut is very close to Plum Island, a government bioweapons research facility. And one of the products that came out of Lyme disease was a whole broad spectrum of things they didn't understand, and mostly they were new, or a tiny spirochete. That's a little spiral, drills into your cells and causes all kinds of grief. A friend of mine with chronic fatigue syndrome studied everything about it, and finally he had a doctor look through a microscope, and it was crawling with little spirochetes, and that was what was sapping his energy, etc. He had huge fights with Blue Cross Blue Shield because they said, well, this is a syndrome, it's not really a disease, so we're not covering you. And so there are half a dozen, maybe 10 different things like fibromyalgia that all link back to Lyme disease. If you ever get a blood transfusion, realize they don't test for Lyme disease, and it is passed on in many cases of blood transfusions.
let me clarify that. Chronic fatigue syndrome is another like fibromyalgia that doesn't have a real diagnosis or anything objective to it. But Lyme disease does. Lyme disease is real, diagnosable. You can prove that it's been properly treated and you've been cured of it. It's chronic Lyme disease that doesn't have a objective, all kinds of money convincing people they have chronic Lyme disease. I have a friend who's into it.
But if you look through the microscope and you see Lyme disease with somebody suffering from chronic fatigue syndrome.
No, you can measure it. You don't even need to see spirochetes. You can actually measure the reaction to real Lyme disease, but not chronic Lyme disease. So if that person had real Lyme disease, that's diagnosable and treatable. But chronic Lyme disease doesn't have it. Doesn't have that.
They have chronic fatigue syndrome, and they found evidence of Lyme disease as the cause. They could not convince the insurance company to pay for it, even though it was very clearly a real disease.
Yeah, well, there are borderline areas, and again, because of the abuses of things like chronic Lyme disease, I can see why some carriers wouldn't want to cover that, but again, I don't think government regulation is the solution to it. You want to run through, I know we've had this thing about memes, but I have fun collecting them, and I had a bunch that related to this, so I thought I'd show them. You can just run through them unless somebody violently objects. Go ahead.
You just tell me when to go to the next
Go
one.
ahead. Go ahead. Some of them are statements rather than memes.
Now, this statement here, I think we could have a whole session on that right there, because the question of what is a right, and does government even give you rights? So I'm going to ask the people here, is there anybody who feels that they are a sort of, whether rights are given by government or simply exist sort of non-abstract way, Ken?
Out by our creator.
Yeah.
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 And written on it in relation to healthcare as a right,
Mhm.
in the general sense, which I agree with you would be.
Well, would
good
people
topic.
be perhaps by a political scientist or a philosopher as to what right, the relationship of rights to government?
There's an excellent talk in Ireland about rights.
Oh, really?
Yes. It's about
I would like to see somebody from CU or somebody by Skype to talk about what are deep philosophical issues. Well, be that as
that's
it may.
That's an excellent statement right there. It's perfect. You can't.
Well, you see, that is your quite liberal.
Yeah.
Okay, but there are plenty of other people who feel rights are different than what's up.
I know that, and they're wrong.
Well,
Why? I don't want to pay for somebody else's kid. I don't like to have a gun put to my head, give money so somebody else's kid, somebody else can have health care.
very, very libertarian
Yeah.
and worthy of having somebody who takes an opposite and talk to us with that about that.
I have good physicians that are good docs, caring, that think healthcare is a right, and I try simplest way I've come up with is that rights are something you inherently, they're not given to you or granted or anything. They are something you inherently have.
Right to healthcare implies that you have the right to force other people to serve you and
Yes.
to provide for you.
That's right. Provided by somebody else. It's
Yeah,
not
you're
something
infringing
you
on their
have
rights.
inherently. Go ahead. Well, let's see if we can get through the. Thomas Sowell is one of my favorite
Oh, isn't he
writers. I've
great?
read all his books, and this one relates to the issue of what I was calling systems. Things that are determined by individual choices under stable rule of law are not systems. They're not isms, like capitalism or even socialism. So I like this one particularly. Go ahead.
Well, we have this
Yeah.
gentleman over
Oh.
here.
Can you?
What were you talking about just a minute ago, before you launched into this slide?
Oh,
Whether
Rights.
governments,
Rights.
Rights.
rights and governments.
Rights are something you already have. You have them inherently. They're not something given to you or provided or granted.
Obamacare was promised to reduce insurance premiums that lied. And Obama, it now turns out, was funding it by raiding Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac of their investor profits. He simply stole. And that was taken to a federal judge who said, no, that's not okay. It was taken up on appeal with the Obama Justice Department fighting it, and then the holdover attorneys continuing to fight for stealing money to fund Obamacare. And Donald Trump finally said, no, our Justice Department is not going to file that appeal or continue it. And so, as best I can tell, Obamacare is fully imploding throughout the system. And would you care to comment on that and how we get out of this mess?
Well, one of the memes up here, I think, is Thomas Sowell, is this issue of if you get rid of Obamacare, doesn't work or for whatever reason, what are you going to replace it with? Well, to him and to me, that's like, well, you have a tumor and we're going to take it out. What are we going to replace it with?
Yeah.
It doesn't make sense. There's no government solution. So it's not like this is bad and our system, our law or whatever is
Scott, can I
going to
ask
solve
you
it.
just get
Yeah.
closer to the
Yeah.
microphone?
See if, but I think that's
You mentioned
the thing.
non-Paul.
There's no replacement for a government attempt to control things from the top down.
Does that include Medicare and Medicaid?
Yeah,
Okay.
absolutely. Go ahead.
Oh, sorry.
Oh, there's another. I mean, philosophically, this relates to this whole thing is that somehow government knows what you want or what you need or how to run things. Well, the people in government come from the same people that are too stupid and too lazy and too whatever to do it for themselves, so they have to have government force it for them. It's not like somehow just because you get into government you have gifts to run things or figure out how other people should act or behave. And this sort of relates to that. And people, sometimes you can get them to admit how poor a job government does at the various things it tries to do, like the TSA. I just saw another one. But they're going to run your healthcare needs and decide what you need and what you can have and so on. Well, that really doesn't make sense. Go ahead. There, this is the one I was referring to. What would you replace it with? What nonsense. When you put out a fire, what do you replace it with? You know, it's the assumption is if we just had the right plan, everything would be fine. Well, I'm sorry, but there isn't a right plan from the top down. So it's a question of getting rid of it, not replacing it. Go ahead. Oh yeah, that's the basic libertarian one. If you have a right to health care, well, that's your share. Okay. Who's going to pay? How are you going to get that? Who's going to pay for it? Who's going to provide it? Go ahead. Oh, this is a real meme. This is one they use these same pictures all over the place, and this one ends up with, I don't think it means what you think it means.
From the Princess Bride.
Right. That's right. That's where that's from. Okay. Yeah, there's another
That's good.
That is.
classic libertarian.
Where'd you find these, Scott? Liberty memes?
I get them all over the place on Facebook. I basically, when I see one, I just copy it off or edit it, and then when I did this talk, I just selected ones I thought were funny. Go ahead. That might be the last. No. Yeah, this is what I was talking about. Surrounded by people who don't grasp individual liberty and basic economics, and that those people wanted to collectively make decisions on how you should run your life.
So we're talking about Boulder.
Yeah, right. Right. Yeah.
Next.
Yeah, that may be no. Yeah. Yeah, that's when I talk to other doctors and I talk about single payer and Medicare for all and so on, and point out that those are government monopolies. It's like if it was a private company that had a monopoly, that would really be bad. We could never have that, but the government, well, that's no problem.
Can you read this one
That's
aloud?
what Boulder just did.
Yeah.
We just, it sounds bad, it's a
Yeah.
monopoly, so
Yeah.
let's have a government
Yes.
run monopoly.
Yes, there you go. Exactly. That's right. As long as we get to control the government. If the wrong person is president, well, that's bad. But go ahead. Oh, I like these. There's a whole bunch of these too. No one has a right to the labors. It's cut off, but no one has a right to the labors of others.
Oh, sorry for the cutoff.
When socialism didn't work in the Soviet Union and Venezuela because they didn't do it right. If we had Bernie
Right.
Sanders, we'd do it right.
Oh, yeah. Well, see, that's a misconception to me. That's a misconception of what socialism is. Socialism is not a system or a plan. It's not communism, capitalism, Nazism, whatever. Socialism is the idea that the believer or someone he believes in knows what's best for other people. That's what socialism is really at. When they use government, they're basically using an authority or a force to try to force their views on other people.
Which works for 5-year-olds, it doesn't work for us.
Yes, right. So I think that's the last one.
It might be. Let me see.
Oh,
Nope.
no, I found that. Oh, yeah, this one I added on. I just found this. This is when you suggest that health is not a right to your liberal friends.
I can make this out. It's Bart Simpson, and what's surrounding him is a whole bunch of guns.
Yeah.
So I think that's. Thank you so much, Scott.
You're welcome.
And with that, I am going to stop the recording.